The moment I stepped off the plane, the roar of the engine still ringing in my ears, I imagined the feel of my daughter's arms around me, the relief of finally being home after a grueling 12 months in deployment. I pictured the familiar warmth of my own bed, the quiet comfort of my house, and the laugh of my little girl that had kept me going through sleepless nights and endless missions. I never imagined that my reunion would be interrupted by flashing lights, the stern officer, and the crushing weight of handcuffs. My name is Jason Mercer. I serve in the military because I believed in something greater than myself, because honor and loyalty weren't just words, they were a way of life. I spent years learning to trust my instincts, to read people, to survive in the worst conditions imaginable. I was trained to face the enemy with courage, to protect my squad and my country, and I had done it. But nothing in all my training could have prepared me for the enemy waiting at my own front door. Vanessa, my wife, the woman I had promised to protect, the mother of my daughter, the person I thought loved me as fiercely as I loved her. I watched her from across the street as the officer explained the charges: financial fraud, falsified documents, and allegations of domestic abuse. Every word felt like a punch to the chest. I wanted to scream, to run across the street and rip her face off, but the law didn't care about my disbelief. The handcuffs bit into my wrists, cold and unyielding, as the officer's voice became a blur. I realized in that moment that betrayal could wear the face of someone you trusted most. Through the crowd of confused neighbors and the murmurs of gossip, I saw Emily. My little girl, barely 8, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. She didn't understand what had happened, and I didn't have the chance to explain. Her tiny hand reached for me instinctively, but she was pulled back by a neighbor who tried to comfort her. My heart twisted seeing her like that, my daughter caught in the crossfire of a war I hadn't chosen but was forced into at home. Even as I was led away, my mind started racing. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Vanessa had planned this. She had the means, the motive, and the patience to destroy my life the moment I returned. I had faced bullets, explosions, and insurgents, and yet nothing was as painful as realizing the person you loved could weaponize the law against you. I didn't cry. Not then. Not for myself. But I promised Emily, and even silently to myself, that justice would come. Not vengeance, not anger, but justice. Vanessa had underestimated me, underestimated what it meant to be a father, underestimated what it meant to fight for the truth. And I would make sure that when this was over, she would understand that betrayal carries a price I intended to collect in full. The car door slammed behind me, the engine's growl drowning out the murmurs of the crowd, and in that instant, everything I had worked for, everything I had believed in was on the line. But one thing remained untouched, my resolve. This war wasn't over, and I wasn't done fighting. The first night in the holding cell was colder than any battlefield I had ever faced. The metal bed beneath me pressed against my back, unforgiving. The fluorescent light overhead flickered intermittently, casting long, wavering shadows that danced across the walls like phantoms. I lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking of Vanessa, thinking of Emily, thinking of all the ways my life had been turned upside down in a single orchestrated strike. How could someone I loved, someone I trusted, plan this so meticulously? It was impossible to believe, yet impossible to deny. The more I thought about it, the more I realized the depth of her manipulation. Vanessa hadn't just acted out of spite or anger. She had spent months weaving a web around me, tightening each thread until it became a cage. Every smile she gave me, every word of encouragement, every innocent gesture had been part of the performance. I remembered the last conversation we had before I deployed, her voice warm, almost teasing, telling me she would hold down the fort while I was gone. I had nodded, reassured, and left with the belief that my home would be waiting for me in the same state I had left it. How naive I had been. Flashbacks came in fragments, like shards of glass cutting through the darkness of my cell. I remembered the subtle digs disguised as jokes at my farewell party, the way she would jokingly question my ability to manage the house alone, the way she casually mentioned needing extra money for emergencies in a tone that now seemed rehearsed. Each memory, once trivial, now felt like a brick in the foundation of her plan. I had been blind to it, too trusting, too focused on the war abroad to see the one brewing at home. And then there were the whispers, the gossip that Vanessa had been spinning long before my return. Neighbors, friends, colleagues, people I had known for years, had all been fed small, carefully curated pieces of misinformation. Vanessa knew how to play them, to manipulate perceptions, to make lies feel like truth. My childhood neighbor, Mrs. Linton, had commented to a friend on the phone, "I'm not saying Jason's guilty, but Vanessa seemed so concerned about the finances, and that was all it took." The seed had been planted, and it grew into a forest of doubt that no one had questioned. Detective Karen Holt was assigned to my case shortly after my arraignment. She was sharp, intelligent, and professional in a way that immediately commanded respect. From the start, I could see she sensed the discrepancies in Vanessa's story. There was a flicker in her eyes when she asked questions, a subtle tightening around her jaw when she reviewed the files. She was sympathetic, but she was bound by law, by procedure, by evidence. Her hands were tied in many ways, and I understood that. But even within those constraints, there was a glimmer of hope, someone who might see through the lies. I began to understand that if I wanted to fight back, I couldn't just rely on the law or on sympathetic detectives. I would have to do what I had done on the battlefield: plan, strategize, gather intelligence, and strike with precision. My first task was to begin collecting evidence, every shred of proof that could expose Vanessa's schemes. It wasn't easy. My communication was limited. Calls were monitored, visits were brief, and every word I spoke could be twisted against me. But I wasn't going to let that stop me. I had a lawyer, a smart, pragmatic woman named Lydia, who quickly became my lifeline. Through her, I began to unravel the threads of Vanessa's deception. I learned that she had siphoned funds from joint accounts, manipulated invoices, and even forged signatures to create the illusion of financial irresponsibility on my part. Each discovery was a dagger to my chest, not because I hadn't anticipated betrayal, but because of the cold, calculated way she had executed it. I imagined her sitting in our living room, the same room where Emily and I had spent lazy Sundays reading books and playing board games, meticulously planning how to ruin my reputation, how to isolate me from everyone who cared. The social network Vanessa had curated around her played a crucial role in her plan. Friends who had once laughed with me at barbecue parties, who had celebrated birthdays and graduations, now whispered behind their hands, repeating Vanessa's carefully selected phrases. "Jason seems off lately. I don't know what he's been doing while deployed. Vanessa is just trying to protect Emily." It was maddening. The people who should have been my allies were unknowingly complicit in my downfall. I began cataloging everything in my mind, every conversation, every message, every interaction that could serve as proof. It was like assembling an army of invisible witnesses, each waiting for the right moment to testify against the woman I had loved. I thought of Emily constantly, how this betrayal had affected her, how she had been manipulated by Vanessa's words and gestures. My daughter had trusted her mother implicitly, and now she was seeing the cracks, sensing the tension, unsure who to believe. Detective Holt was cautious but curious about what I had discovered. She listened as I recounted incidents that now, in hindsight, were glaringly suspicious: the unexplained charges on credit cards, the late-night phone calls Vanessa claimed were work emergencies, the way she seemed to know details about my finances that she shouldn't have had access to. She took notes, asked precise questions, and maintained a careful, professional distance. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, the internal struggle between following procedure and pursuing the truth. One night, after another long day of interviews and legal maneuvering, I allowed myself to sit back in a tiny cell and think about strategy. If Vanessa had built this web, then I had to understand it completely before taking action. I visualized her routines, her social connections, the way she manipulated perceptions. I imagined the dominoes falling, one by one, once the truth was revealed, and I vowed to ensure that when they fell, they would fall in a way that was precise, unassailable, and utterly undeniable. There were moments of rage, of course, when I imagined confronting her directly, screaming at her for the betrayal, shaking her until she remembered what love meant. But I knew that would play into her hands. Emotional outbursts were predictable, easy to twist, and could be used against me in court. I had to be calm, calculated, and patient. This was no longer just a fight to prove my innocence. It was a battle to reclaim control, to protect my daughter, and to expose a web of lies so intricate that even I had been ensnared. In my mind, I began reconstructing every interaction with Vanessa over the past year. The friendly smiles, the sarcastic comments, the casual warnings about trusting the wrong people, the hints about financial instability, everything suddenly made sense. She had been laying the groundwork for this moment long before I had even packed my bags for deployment. It was brilliance in execution, twisted brilliance, and I had to respect that even as I despised it. The days turned into weeks. I learned to navigate the constraints of my situation, using lawyer-mediated calls to gather more information, speaking carefully to Emily when allowed, and using Detective Holt as a sounding board without overstepping legal boundaries. Every piece of information she gave me was like a small victory, a confirmation that I wasn't imagining things, that Vanessa's deceit was real, and that justice could be pursued. Gossip continued to be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was a tool Vanessa had used to isolate me. On the other, it became a weapon in my arsenal once I began subtly influencing the same circles with truths she couldn't refute. I planted small pieces of factual information, transactions, emails, inconsistencies that, once noticed by mutual friends, began to seed doubt. Slowly, carefully, the perception she had controlled began to fracture. There were nights when despair threatened to overtake me, when the walls of the cell seemed to close in, and the thought of losing everything, my daughter, my reputation, my career, weighed heavily on my chest. But then I would think of Emily's face, her small hands reaching for me, and I would steel myself. She deserved a father who could fight back, who could show her that betrayal did not mean defeat, that patience and strategy could prevail over deceit. Through it all, Detective Holt remained a quiet presence in the background, a constant reminder that while the law was rigid, it was not blind. She asked questions that forced Vanessa to respond, noticed inconsistencies that even I hadn't, and quietly guided the investigation without ever revealing her own doubts. I learned to read her expressions, to anticipate the questions she would ask, and to prepare my responses meticulously. Each interaction was a step forward in untangling the web Vanessa had woven. By the time I was released on bail, I had a clear understanding of the scope of Vanessa's deception. It was larger than I had imagined. Financial schemes, character assassination, manipulation of our social circle, and even preemptive lies to law enforcement. But I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. Each day, each careful move, each whispered truth planted in the right ears brought me closer to dismantling everything she had built. The fight was just beginning, but for the first time since stepping off that plane, I felt a sense of control. I had survived war zones, outsmarted enemies in foreign lands, and endured the harshest conditions. Vanessa's web, for all its complexity, was another challenge, and I was determined to meet it head-on. She had underestimated me, underestimated what it meant to be a father, a soldier, a man with patience, intelligence, and resolve. And as I walked out of the courthouse, Emily running into my arms, I whispered to myself a promise. The web she had woven would not trap me forever. Every lie, every manipulation, every betrayal would be exposed. And when that day came, Vanessa would finally understand what it meant to face the consequences of her actions. The night I got out on bail, the streetlights seemed to flicker with a kind of cruel irony. Freedom, yes, but freedom under the constant shadow of suspicion. Freedom under the weight of a betrayal so profound it left a gnawing ache in my chest. I stepped into my car and gripped the steering wheel, hands trembling, not from fear, but from a mix of rage, confusion, and resolve. I couldn't face this alone. I wasn't just fighting for my own reputation anymore. I was fighting for Emily, for the last shreds of trust in a family that Vanessa had shredded before I even returned. Marcus Talbot had been the first person I called. Marcus wasn't just a friend. He was the brother I had chosen in the chaos of military service, a man who had watched my back when bullets rained down and the world seemed to burn around us. We had trained together, bled together, survived things that would have broken most men. And now Marcus was the one person I could trust implicitly to help me navigate a battlefield of a different kind. Deception, lies, and betrayal at home found him at his apartment, a modest place cluttered with old military photos, medals, and souvenirs of campaigns long past. He opened the door before I could knock, the surprise in his eyes quickly replaced by a hard, knowing stare. "I heard," he said quietly, his voice carrying that steady, unwavering tone I had relied on in the most dangerous moments overseas. "You're clean, right?" I nodded, too exhausted to speak at first, and then the words spilled out. The arrest, the betrayal, Vanessa's manipulation, Emily's fear. I laid everything bare, every suspicion, every piece of evidence I had gathered so far. Marcus listened silently, nodding occasionally, absorbing each detail, mentally calculating the next steps. "We're going to need a full strategy," he said finally. "This isn't just about proving you innocent. It's about dismantling her web without giving her a chance to counter. We're talking legal records, digital footprints, financial audits, social perception, everything." That was the moment I realized how big this really was. Vanessa had been building an empire of lies for months, carefully curating perceptions among friends, neighbors, even coworkers. And if we weren't meticulous, patient, and strategic, she would continue to control the narrative. Marcus and I spent hours mapping out her circle of influence, identifying people who could unknowingly be swayed and tracing the patterns of her deception. Vanessa had been clever. She knew how to manipulate social perception, planting doubts among Emily's teachers, subtly suggesting that I was unstable after my deployment, that I couldn't be trusted with finances or even with our daughter. The gossip had spread like wildfire, fueled by Vanessa's charm and strategic half-truths. One neighbor, Mr. Hargrove, had even mentioned in passing that he wasn't sure Jason had been completely honest while overseas. Little by little, Vanessa had poisoned every space we had shared. We began compiling evidence in secret. Marcus helped me scan emails, trace bank transfers, and document inconsistencies in Vanessa's statements. We reviewed digital conversations, analyzing metadata, timestamps, and locations. Everything that could prove the story she had built was a fabrication. It was painstaking work, but it gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt since leaving the deployment zone. Each discovery was a small victory, a reminder that I was not helpless, and that patience and strategy were more powerful than raw anger. Yet amidst all of this, my mind constantly returned to Emily. She was the reason I had to stay calm, the reason I had to act like nothing had broken me. She didn't deserve to grow up thinking her father was a criminal, or to feel abandoned by the very people who were supposed to protect her. Every evening, I would make sure she was asleep before I allowed myself to process the rage, the grief, the betrayal. I would read stories to her, tuck her in, and force myself to smile even when my chest ached. Marcus reminded me often, she's watching you. How you handle this will teach her how to handle her own battles. The social dynamics were tricky. Vanessa had friends and family who were completely under her spell. They repeated her stories uncritically, laughing at jokes that cast me as unstable or irresponsible. But with Marcus's help, we began planting subtle truths, small inconsistencies in her narrative that couldn't be dismissed. We didn't confront her publicly yet. The timing had to be perfect. Even a single misstep could alert her, making her tighten the web around me and Emily. Patience was the weapon we wielded above all. At the same time, we explored legal avenues. My lawyer, Lydia, provided insights on subpoena power, document requests, and the intricate ways Vanessa had tried to cover her tracks. We traced financial anomalies, noting accounts she had accessed secretly, transfers she had made, and debts she had incurred in my name. Every detail mattered. Every little proof was a stepping stone toward dismantling the carefully curated illusion she had built around her lies. Marcus and I also began rehearsing contingencies. What if she realized we were building a case? What if she tried to isolate Emily further? What if she attempted to manipulate public opinion more aggressively? We considered every angle, every potential counterattack, and planned accordingly. In these moments, I understood why trust in allies was everything. On the battlefield, you rely on your squad. Here, Marcus was my squad. His loyalty, insight, and calm presence were invaluable. Without him, I would have been floundering, reacting instead of acting, and that would have played directly into Vanessa's hands. Despite the focus on strategy, there were emotional battles too. Some nights, I would sit alone, replaying memories with Vanessa before the deployment. Our first apartment, our first Christmas, the day Emily was born. Those memories were bittersweet, reminders of what had been real, what had been love. But I could not allow sentiment to cloud judgment. Every feeling of betrayal, every flash of anger, had to be channeled into patience, precision, and action. Marcus reminded me constantly, emotions are tools, Jason. Don't let them control you, let them sharpen your focus. As the days passed, our strategy became more sophisticated. We created a timeline of Vanessa's movements during my deployment, correlating social media posts, financial transactions, and eyewitness accounts. We identified gaps in her alibis, discrepancies in her explanations, and patterns of manipulation designed to isolate me from friends and family. Each revelation added fuel to my determination. Vanessa's web was extensive, yes, but it was not infallible. Every thread we pulled exposed another weakness, another opportunity to reclaim control. The gossip network she had cultivated was perhaps the most delicate element. Marcus and I had to navigate it carefully, subtly influencing opinions without appearing confrontational. We leaned on mutual friends who were naturally skeptical, providing small truths that contradicted Vanessa's lies. Slowly, very slowly, doubts began to emerge. People whispered to each other, noticing discrepancies, questioning statements, noticing behavior that didn't align with the story she had told. It was gratifying to watch, but we had to remain patient. Too much too soon could alert her to our strategy. Emily remained central to everything. Her laughter, her questions, her innocent observations, they reminded me of why I had to remain calm, why I had to be careful. Every lie Vanessa had told her had to be gently countered, not with harsh truths that could scare her, but with love, reassurance, and subtle guidance toward reality. I began teaching her how to observe, how to trust her instincts, how to see the difference between words and actions. In those moments, I realized that this fight wasn't just about me. It was about shaping the kind of woman she would become, someone who could recognize manipulation and still maintain her integrity. Marcus and I also set up communication channels that Vanessa couldn't intercept. We used encrypted messaging, coded references, and prearranged meeting spots. Every move had to be discreet, invisible to her prying eyes. We rehearsed scenarios where she might attempt to monitor Emily, trying to predict her reactions and planning our countermeasures accordingly. The parallels to military operations were uncanny. Every action had a purpose, every decision weighed against potential consequences. It was exhausting mentally and emotionally, but necessary. I remembered a lesson from deployment. Patience wins wars. Impulse loses lives. I had seen it countless times in hostile territory, and now it applied to this domestic battlefield. Vanessa's web was intricate, but she had underestimated the value of calm, methodical planning. That underestimation would be her undoing. Every lie she had told, every manipulation she had enacted, would eventually unravel, not because of anger or revenge, but because of careful, deliberate exposure. Even as the network of gossip began to shift subtly, Vanessa remained confident. She smiled, she laughed, she maintained the image of control. But I knew the cracks were forming. Her allies began questioning. Her stories didn't align, and the very people she had relied upon to validate her narrative were now seeing inconsistencies. Patience, I reminded myself, was the weapon. Precision was the key. And with Marcus at my side, Emily in my heart, and every piece of evidence cataloged, I felt ready. The night ended quietly, but my mind never rested. I lay in bed thinking of the next steps, replaying social interactions, rehearsing conversations, analyzing documents. Every small victory, every tiny piece of progress, fueled me further. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was building a fortress around Emily, reclaiming our life one calculated move at a time. And when the time came to strike, when the truth could no longer be denied, Vanessa would finally face the consequences of every lie she had spun. I had allies in the shadows, a plan that no one could see, and a resolve forged in fire. And for the first time since that arrest, I felt like the battlefield was mine to control. The first strike is never the loudest. In war, it is calculated, precise, barely noticed until its impact cannot be ignored. I had learned that lesson in Afghanistan, and now facing a battle of a different kind, I knew patience and subtlety were my most powerful weapons. Vanessa had spent months constructing a narrative, manipulating perception, and isolating me from friends, family, and neighbors. It was time to start unraveling it, but carefully, with strategy, not fury. I began by observing. Watching Vanessa, watching her friends, watching the spaces she had controlled so meticulously. If someone betrays you, I reminded myself, patience is more powerful than fury. The smallest misstep, the slightest overreaction, could undo weeks of preparation. My first goal wasn't confrontation, it was planting seeds of doubt. Vanessa had relied on social influence more than anything. Her web of friends, neighbors, and colleagues was her fortress. She had convinced them, with subtle half-truths and casual insinuations, that I was unstable, financially reckless, and emotionally unavailable. It was all reinforced with carefully timed gossip, a remark about money here, a hint about my behavior there, delivered with charm and confidence. She had done this for months, anticipating my return, knowing that a single allegation could take root and flourish before I even had the chance to defend myself. I began by sharing carefully chosen truths, small and verifiable, through indirect channels. A casual email to one of her close friends, framed as concern for Emily's well-being, included hints of inconsistencies I had documented, financial records that contradicted Vanessa's claims, emails where she had lied about transactions, a neighbor's statement about her late-night visits to the bank supposedly alone. I didn't confront her publicly. I didn't demand attention. I simply planted the seed. Curiosity is a powerful thing, and gossip thrives in fertile soil. Vanessa noticed immediately. She may not have known the source, but her reactions were unmistakable. Texts became sharper, conversations more controlled, the laughter of her friend a little too loud, a little too rehearsed. She sensed something shifting, even if she couldn't articulate what. The uncertainty gnawed at her, slowly chipping away at the confidence she had displayed since my return. The first public arena I chose was Emily's school. A science fair, simple enough, a space where parents mingled and children proudly displayed projects. I volunteered to help Emily with hers. At first glance, it seemed like an innocuous act, a father engaged with his child, but in the context of Vanessa's accusations of irresponsibility, it was a quiet contradiction. Emily noticed, too. She tugged at my sleeve, her small voice filled with excitement. "Dad, you're helping me?" Her smile reminded me of why I had to stay calm, strategic, and patient. Every action, however subtle, mattered. I made careful, indirect remarks to friends and colleagues. At the PTA meeting, I mentioned small discrepancies in fundraising records, casually noting that some contributions didn't align with Vanessa's explanations. A few parents exchanged glances, whispering to one another. I saw the shift, the subtle questioning of previously accepted assumptions. Each minor revelation was a thread, pulling at the edges of the web Vanessa had built. Marcus and I continued our meticulous planning. He monitored reactions, noting raised eyebrows, pauses in conversation, and subtle changes in behavior. He reminded me that timing was critical. Exposing too much too soon could alert Vanessa, allowing her to tighten control and manipulate perceptions even further. Every action had to be deliberate, every move part of a larger strategy. Meanwhile, Vanessa's social circle began to show cracks. Friends who had once laughed unquestioningly at her comments now hesitated, their loyalty tempered by the inconsistencies they were beginning to notice. It was almost imperceptible at first, a pause here, hesitant glance there, but slowly it grew. People who had been complicit in her narrative began to question and doubt and whisper among themselves. The dominoes were beginning to fall. I also used Emily as an inadvertent ally. Her innocence and clarity were powerful tools, if handled with care. She noticed tension in ways adults often overlooked, the nervous glance of a neighbor, the quiet side conversations of friends, the subtle unease in Vanessa's expressions. One afternoon at the park, Emily tugged my hand and whispered, "Dad, she looks scared." Did I do something? Kneeling to her level, I smiled gently. "No, kiddo. We're just making sure the truth comes out. You're helping just by being you." That small interaction reminded me that strategy didn't mean coldness. It meant protecting her, teaching her resilience, and showing that bravery comes in many forms. Vanessa's paranoia increased. She began checking her phone incessantly, scrutinizing her friend's behavior, her posture tense, hands fidgeting as if holding on to control. One evening, at a casual dinner gathering, she laughed a little too loudly, answered questions a little too quickly, and subtly tried to steer conversations away from topics where the truth could slip. I sat across from her, calm, measured, observing. Her mask was cracking, her confidence eroding quietly but unmistakably. Our strategy extended beyond social gatherings. Marcus and I pored over financial records, emails, and digital correspondence. Every anomaly, every minor contradiction became a potential tool. We traced hidden accounts, documented forged signatures, and noted inconsistencies in Vanessa's explanations. Each discovery reinforced the strategy, exposed subtly, never aggressively, revealed patterns, not isolated incidents. Let the evidence speak, not emotion. Lydia, my lawyer, provided critical guidance. Certain documents could not yet be revealed publicly, but could be referenced in conversations that planted doubt. Legal constraints required precision. I learned to balance exposure with discretion, crafting a strategy that would allow Vanessa's lies to unravel without giving her an opening to counterattack. The gossip network, Vanessa's strongest weapon, slowly turned against her. Parents whispered about discrepancies in school fundraising, neighbors noticed unexplained transactions, and friends began to question her explanations. Every subtle hint, every innocuous comment I made, began to fracture the narrative she had so carefully maintained. It was a delicate dance, but the rhythm was changing in my favor. Emily continued to watch. Her observations, small but acute, mirrored my own. She saw inconsistencies in her mother's behavior, noticed the tension in social gatherings, and began to question the narrative she had been fed. Our moments together, reading bedtime stories or working on homework, were opportunities to reinforce calm, integrity, and the quiet power of strategy. She learned that strength was not always loud, and that patience and observation were as important as action. One particular evening, I organized a small dinner with a few mutual friends, ostensibly casual but strategically chosen. Conversations were directed subtly, truths were shared indirectly, and patterns of Vanessa's lies were highlighted without confrontation. The effect was immediate. Friends exchanged glances, whispers began, and Vanessa's attempts to steer the conversation were clumsy. Her nervous energy was palpable, her carefully crafted facade faltering. Even at work, the cracks appeared. A document she had submitted, supposedly reflecting my financial mismanagement, contained discrepancies that colleagues noticed. Emails she had sent to justify expenses contradicted one another. Each inconsistency, minor alone but powerful in context, began to undermine her credibility. My approach was methodical. Reveal patterns, not isolated mistakes. Allow perception to shift naturally. Through it all, patience remained my most powerful weapon. Every day, I reminded myself that impulsive action could play into Vanessa's hands, reinforcing her narrative of instability. Calm, strategic exposure of truth was far more potent than any display of anger. Every whisper, every subtle revelation, chipped away at her control. Every observer who began to doubt her narrative was a victory. Emily's presence reminded me why precision mattered. Her small hand in mine, her wide eyes observing interactions, her trust in me, they were my compass. I had to model restraint, intelligence, and strategy, not just for the battle at hand, but for the lessons she would carry into adulthood. Bravery, I realized, was not only about confronting danger directly. It was about navigating a world of manipulation with calm and resolve. As the first strike continued to unfold, Vanessa's confidence eroded. She smiled, laughed, and projected control, but subtle cues betrayed her. A flicker of doubt in her eyes, a forced tone in conversation, a hesitation in her step. All signals that the web she had spun was loosening. And each tiny crack reinforced my patience, my strategy, and the careful, deliberate path I had set. By the end of the week, the first dominoes had fallen. Friends whispered, colleagues noticed, neighbors questioned, and Vanessa's influence began to wane. The initial strike was complete, not with confrontation or fury, but with quiet precision. Every subtle exposure, every carefully placed truth, had begun dismantling the illusion she had crafted. I reflected on the process, realizing that strategy and patience had won what anger and impulse never could. The first strike had not destroyed her, but it had begun the unraveling. It had set a precedent. I was not powerless. I was not a victim. I was a calculated force, moving deliberately, shaping the battlefield, and teaching Emily the same principles of resilience, observation, and patience. The first strike was subtle, precise, and effective. It was a quiet assertion of control, a careful exposure of lies, a lesson in strategy, and a demonstration of bravery. Emily saw glimpses of her father's resilience and integrity. Vanessa felt the subtle pressure of her crumbling web, and I, for the first time since my arrest, felt a measure of power, patience, and momentum on my side. The war was far from over, but the first strike had been made, and the echoes of that strike would ripple through every corner of Vanessa's carefully curated life. I was ready to continue, step by step, methodically, ensuring that every lie she had told, every manipulation she had enacted, would eventually be laid bare, and that Emily would witness the quiet, strategic courage of her father in the process. The moment I laid eyes on the documents, I felt a surge of vindication, but it was tempered by the weight of what they represented. Months of deception, months of calculated lies, all meticulously hidden in plain sight, had finally left a tangible trail. Vanessa's fingers had reached into every corner of our shared life, siphoning funds, forging transactions, and presenting herself as the responsible, concerned spouse. The evidence wasn't just damning, it was undeniable. The truth, once obscured by charm and manipulation, was now laid bare. I had spent countless hours with Marcus and Lydia going over bank statements, cross-referencing emails, and tracing the subtle discrepancies Vanessa had left behind. Each document told a story, and together they wove a tapestry of deliberate deceit. It wasn't just minor embezzlement. It was a systematic effort to portray me as irresponsible, reckless, and incapable. Every transfer she had made, every account she had manipulated, every financial claim she had invented was designed to isolate me socially and legally. And now, thanks to careful documentation, those claims could be disproven. Marcus leaned over my shoulder, pointing at a series of transfers that had occurred during my deployment. "See this? She transferred funds from the joint account to her private one almost weekly. And here, she even covered it with fake invoices from a vendor that doesn't exist. I nodded, feeling a mix of anger and satisfaction. Anger because of the betrayal, satisfaction because finally, the evidence was concrete. Vanessa had built a fortress of lies, and I had found a blueprint to dismantle it. The hypocrisy was staggering. While portraying herself as the devoted mother and wife, she had been the architect of my social and financial ruin. Friends, neighbors, colleagues, they had all been deceived by a combination of charm, selective truth, and careful omission. It was infuriating, but also empowering. The first strike had shaken her foundation. Now, with proof in hand, I could begin the second phase of the plan, exposure. The social fallout was immediate once small pieces of evidence began to surface. Friends who had once unquestioningly believed Vanessa's narrative now hesitated, their expressions flickering between confusion and doubt. Gossip, once a weapon wielded solely by her, began to turn into a tool for truth. Whispered questions emerged. Are you sure the transaction was legitimate? I saw an email that doesn't match what Vanessa said. Even her closest allies were forced to confront inconsistencies they had previously ignored. Vanessa's reaction was predictable, though no less infuriating. She clutched her phone like a lifeline, scanning messages from friends and family, attempting to control perceptions, but the momentum was slipping from her grasp. Her words became sharper, her tone defensive, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker in her eyes. The mask of control she had worn so perfectly was beginning to crack. Detective Holt, ever perceptive, began noticing discrepancies in Vanessa's story. During a routine follow-up, she asked pointed questions about transactions that didn't align with her previous statements. The confidence Vanessa had relied upon to manipulate perceptions faltered under the scrutiny of someone trained to detect inconsistencies. Holt's professional curiosity was piqued, and her subtle support gave me a quiet but critical advantage. I began to plan the ultimate expose. Every piece of evidence had to be placed carefully, strategically. Public confrontation was a risk. Too early, and Vanessa could manipulate the narrative. Too late, and she could attempt damage control. The goal was to reveal the truth in a way that was undeniable, unassailable, and permanent. Each bank statement, email, and witness testimony would be part of a larger picture, a mosaic of betrayal that even her charm couldn't obscure. Emily noticed the changes too. Slowly, cautiously, she began trusting me again. Afternoon visits turned into longer sessions of homework help, board games, and shared meals. I watched her small hand reach for mine, her eyes filled with recognition and hope, and I felt the weight of responsibility settle even more heavily on my shoulders. She deserved a father who could protect her from lies, who could show her the power of patience and strategy over impulsive anger. Each moment of bonding reinforced my resolve. This fight wasn't just for me, it was for her. The planning sessions with Marcus were intense. We mapped out Vanessa's social circles, noting which friends were most susceptible to influence, which had already shown signs of doubt, and which would need subtle persuasion. We prepared evidence packages that could be revealed selectively, each time to maximize impact. Every email, every bank statement, every witness account was cataloged, cross-referenced, and backed up multiple times. Nothing could be left to chance. Vanessa, in the meantime, continued her attempts to manipulate public perception. She called friends, sent messages, and posted carefully curated social media updates portraying herself as the victim of an unstable husband. But with each small revelation I strategically released, her credibility eroded. Friends began questioning her motives, neighbors noticed inconsistencies, and colleagues hesitated to engage with the narrative she presented. Her carefully built persona of control began to unravel, and she couldn't stop it. Emily's reactions were subtle but profound. She noticed my calm determination, my careful explanations, and my unwavering focus. In quiet moments, she would whisper, "Dad, you're really brave." I smiled, kneeling to her level. "No, Emily. Bravery isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's patient. And sometimes it's making sure the truth comes out the right way." Those moments became a source of strength, reinforcing the moral imperative behind my actions. The gossip dynamics played a crucial role. Vanessa's lies had relied on repetition and selective omission, and the disruption of that cycle had an exponential effect. Small conversations in coffee shops, school pickups, and casual neighborhood interactions began to plant doubt. People who had been passive observers of her manipulations now found themselves questioning, verifying, and noticing details they had previously ignored. Each ripple spread, undermining her narrative further. In parallel, Detective Holt continued her investigation, quietly connecting dots that even Vanessa hadn't considered. The combination of official scrutiny and social exposure created a pressure cooker environment. Vanessa's attempts to control the story were increasingly frantic, her messages defensive, and her presence in social spaces tense. The cracks in her facade widened daily, and I observed them with a steady, strategic calm. One evening, I decided it was time to test the waters publicly. At a neighborhood gathering, I casually mentioned a discrepancy in a recent charity donation that Vanessa had coordinated. Her reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath, a forced laugh, and a quick change of subject. But the damage was done. Several friends exchanged glances, quietly noting the inconsistency. It was a small strike, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, but strategically significant. Each micro-moment like this chipped away at her credibility, preparing the stage for the ultimate reveal. Marcus and I worked late into the night, cross-referencing every document, plotting each step meticulously. Every action was intentional. We considered contingencies, potential counterattacks, and ways to protect Emily from collateral damage. The goal was clear: expose the truth, restore my reputation, and shield my daughter from the consequences of Vanessa's deceit. The emotional weight of the process was heavy. Anger, betrayal, and grief bubbled beneath the surface, but I channeled them into strategy rather than reaction. Impulsive confrontation would have played directly into Vanessa's hands. Calm, deliberate exposure was far more powerful. Each calculated move was a lesson for Emily, a living demonstration that patience, intelligence, and integrity could overcome deceit. Vanessa's hypocrisy became increasingly visible to those around her. Friends who had once defended her without question now noticed contradictions. Claims of responsible stewardship contradicted by financial documents, assertions of integrity undermined by clear evidence of manipulation, stories of victimhood that didn't align with observed behavior. Every small revelation added momentum to the growing realization that the narrative she had constructed was false. Emily's trust grew alongside the exposure of truth. Bedtime stories became opportunities for quiet conversation, for guidance, and for subtle teaching about honesty, resilience, and the importance of discernment. Her laughter returned, her questions became more confident, and her belief in my integrity solidified. Each small victory in our personal life mirrored the strategic gains being made publicly. The first wave of exposure created tangible shifts in social perception. Casual conversations at work, neighborhood gatherings, and school events began to reflect growing uncertainty about Vanessa's narrative. People whispered, questioned, and began cross-referencing statements. Vanessa's influence waned as the subtle but undeniable evidence of deceit accumulated. Detective Holt's interest in the case deepened. She began connecting observations from friends and neighbors with financial discrepancies, social interactions, and email evidence. Her subtle support, discreet questions, and methodical analysis complemented the social exposure strategy. Together, these parallel efforts amplified the pressure on Vanessa, creating a situation where her credibility could no longer withstand scrutiny. As the days turned into weeks, the exposure gained momentum. Vanessa's attempts to control the narrative became increasingly frantic, her words defensive and carefully measured. She tried to manipulate social perceptions, but the combination of evidence, strategic exposure, and the natural curiosity of her social circle began to overwhelm her efforts. The web she had spun so meticulously was unraveling, thread by thread. Emily's reactions remained central to my motivation. Her growing trust, her recognition of my integrity, and her subtle observations of social dynamics reinforced the purpose behind every strategic move. Protecting her, teaching her, and demonstrating the power of patience and truth became inseparable from the battle itself. The ultimate expose began to take shape in my mind. Each document, each witness statement, each subtle social cue was a piece of a larger puzzle. The strategy was to reveal Vanessa's deceit in a way that was irrefutable, methodical, and permanent. Timing, precision, and restraint were paramount. Every action, every disclosure would contribute to the inevitable collapse of her narrative. By the end of the week, the first layer of exposure was complete. Social perception had begun to shift, doubt had crept into Vanessa's circle, and Detective Holt was observing inconsistencies with increasing interest. Emily's trust in me had deepened, providing both motivation and emotional grounding. The truth was gaining momentum, and the carefully orchestrated plan to reveal it was ready to move into its next phase. The war of patience, strategy, and subtle power had reached a pivotal point. Vanessa's lies, once unassailable, were now vulnerable. Social perception, legal scrutiny, and emotional resilience combined to create pressure she could no longer manage effectively. The evidence was undeniable, the exposure inevitable, and the ultimate reveal within reach. And as I watched Emily sleep that night, her small hand reaching for mine, I knew that every calculated move, every moment of restraint, and every subtle exposure had been worth it. Justice was not a moment of rage. It was a process, a strategy, and a careful orchestration of truth. And when Vanessa's web finally collapsed, it would do so completely, publicly, and irrevocably. Vanessa's pride was her Achilles heel. I had known it from the first day of this ordeal. While she had spent months constructing an image of control, elegance, and virtue, that very image was a fragile facade, easily cracked under the right pressure. In the world she had carefully curated, perception was everything. And I intended to weaponize it, not with anger or theatrics, but with patience, precision, and subtlety. The first step was observation. I began cataloging her social patterns, noting which friends were most influenced by her narratives, who had unquestioned loyalty, and who might be swayed by the smallest hint of doubt. Vanessa thrived in controlled spaces, dinner parties, school events, local gatherings where she could project perfection. I needed to infiltrate those spaces with truth, so delicate it would seem incidental, yet sharp enough to cut through her lies. Marcus helped map the network. Together, we identified key social nodes, a neighbor who prided himself on knowing everything about everyone, a school mom who had been Vanessa's closest confidant, colleagues who repeated her stories unquestioningly. Each of these nodes represented a potential crack in her social armor. The plan was simple. Subtle truths, delivered strategically, would erode her credibility without direct confrontation. The beauty of this approach was that it was virtually invisible. Gossip would do the work for us. The first leak was almost imperceptible. I sent an innocuous email to a mutual friend, framed as a concern about Emily's well-being, and casually mentioned a financial discrepancy I had documented. It was phrased to appear as concern, not accusation. I was reviewing some of the school contributions, and something doesn't add up. I hope Emily's teacher can clarify. A small detail, easily dismissed on its own, but it was a seed. Seeds grow fastest in fertile soil, and Vanessa's social network was fertile ground for doubt. Within days, whispers began. Friends who had been loyal, repeating Vanessa's carefully crafted narrative, began to hesitate. A comment here, a question there. Did she really say that? I thought I saw an email that contradicted that story. The momentum was subtle, but unmistakable. Gossip, when planted carefully, is a force multiplier. It spreads organically, not through force, and it is impossible to fully control once it begins. Vanessa sensed it immediately. Her laughter became too loud at dinner parties, her gestures slightly overdone, her tone a touch defensive when discussing her life or financial management. She was trying to maintain control, but the very medium she had used to manipulate others' social perception was now being turned against her. The realization was almost tangible. She was losing her grip, and she didn't yet understand why. The next phase involved carefully timed interactions. At Emily's school event, I praised the teachers and volunteers for their diligence, subtly reinforcing that I was engaged, responsible, and attentive. Comments like these, innocuous on their own, created a contrast to the narrative Vanessa had spun. Parents noticed. Some whispered among themselves. Slowly, doubt crept into the social circle. Each comment was a brushstroke in a larger picture that exposed her manipulation without a single direct confrontation. Marcus and I worked late into the evenings, analyzing reactions, documenting inconsistencies, and planning the next moves. The process required discipline. One slip, one overt action, could alert Vanessa and allow her to tighten her web. Revenge is strongest when it's clean, calculated, and silent until the moment of reveal. I reminded myself of this constantly. Every smile, every word, every casual gesture had a purpose. Emily was learning by observation. She noticed small details, like the nervous glance of a friend when a subtle truth was mentioned, or the slight defensiveness in her mother's tone. One afternoon, while helping with homework, she asked, "Dad, why does Mom look so worried sometimes?" I smiled gently. "She's worried because the truth is coming out, sweetie." and truth is stronger than any lie. That moment, small but powerful, reinforced why patience and careful strategy were so important. Emily was not just witnessing the battle, she was learning how to navigate it herself. The social trap was designed to exploit Vanessa's pride. She had always equated control with respect, visibility, and admiration. By introducing doubt subtly, I forced her into defensive positions, where every interaction required effort, calculation, and facade maintenance. Pride, which had served her so well, now worked against her. Friends began noticing inconsistencies, claims that didn't align with observed behavior, small contradictions in her stories, and moments where her control faltered. Detective Holt's observations complemented the social erosion. While I couldn't directly reveal all evidence yet, Holt noted discrepancies between Vanessa's statements and the documented reality. Her inquiries were subtle, professional, and effective. Vanessa's attempts to manipulate perception could not withstand scrutiny from someone trained to detect deception. Every whispered question, every cautious observation, created pressure that Vanessa could not fully manage. At a neighborhood gathering, I executed a carefully planned move. In casual conversation, I referenced a minor but verifiable detail about a shared financial transaction. Vanessa's immediate reaction, sharp inhale, subtle tightening of her smile, was exactly what I had anticipated. Other guests noticed, unconsciously comparing the information with her prior statements. Doubt seated itself. The first domino fell, almost invisible, yet irreversible. Meanwhile, Vanessa's attempts to control the narrative became increasingly frantic. She called friends excessively, crafted social media posts projecting confidence, and reinforced her victim narrative. But the more she acted, the more her inconsistencies became apparent. Social perception, once her weapon, had turned into a mirror reflecting her hypocrisy. The higher she climbed in public displays, the more obvious the cracks became. Marcus and I continued refining the strategy. Each subtle exposure was logged, cross-referenced, and evaluated for impact. We mapped which friends were beginning to question, which remained loyal, and which could be swayed with minimal effort. The plan was meticulous, executed over weeks, ensuring no overt confrontation could be traced back to us. Every whisper, every questioning glance was part of a larger symphony orchestrated for maximum effect. Emily remained the quiet heart of the operation. In casual moments, playgrounds, library visits, or dinner discussions, she absorbed lessons in observation, patience, and subtle influence. Her small acknowledgments, whispered questions, and growing trust reinforced why careful strategy mattered. She began recognizing that power was not always about loud action. Sometimes, it was about influence, timing, and calculated patience. Vanessa's social isolation deepened as whispers became more persistent. Friends began hesitating to repeat her statements, neighbors paused before sharing stories, and colleagues started noting inconsistencies in her explanations. The social trap was closing. Pride, which had once fortified her image, now became a source of vulnerability. Each subtle doubt amplified the next, creating a cascading effect of scrutiny she could not escape. The next move involved digital reinforcement. I strategically shared verifiable facts with select friends, phrased as concern or casual observation. Each message, email, or comment planted a seed of doubt. Social perception is fragile. Once a trusted friend begins to question, others often follow. Gossip spreads faster when it appears organic, and that was precisely what I orchestrated. Vanessa's paranoia intensified. Her movements became calculated, her conversations guarded, her social media posts crafted with extreme care. Yet the pressure of mounting doubt and the inevitability of exposure eroded her confidence. Every gesture, every forced smile, every defensive response betrayed her inner uncertainty. Pride had trapped her in a cage of her own making, and I held the key, invisible but undeniable. Emily observed these shifts, her trust in me deepening. One evening, as we prepared a small dinner together, she whispered, "Dad, I think people are starting to see the truth." I smiled, ruffling her hair gently. "Yes, sweetie. Patience, strategy, and careful timing always win against lies." These moments grounded me, reminding me that this fight was not only about social perception, it was about shaping Emily's understanding of integrity, resilience, and justice. I monitored every interaction, adjusting the plan in real time. Friends who were previously loyal to Vanessa began expressing subtle doubt. Casual conversations at school, neighborhood walks, and local events reflected the growing uncertainty. Social momentum had shifted. Vanessa's carefully maintained facade, once unassailable, was now vulnerable. Each small exposure compounded the next, creating pressure she could not withstand indefinitely. Detective Holt continued to observe, connecting social cues with inconsistencies in statements and documented evidence. Vanessa's attempts to control perception were increasingly futile under professional scrutiny. The combination of social erosion and investigative attention created a strategic pincer movement, isolating her influence and weakening her narrative. The final layer of the social trap involved public interactions designed to contrast my integrity with Vanessa's inconsistency. At a charity event, I spoke candidly about collaborative efforts and transparency in donations. Vanessa attempted to interject with a narrative of control and victimhood, but the audience's attention had shifted. Questions emerged, side glances were exchanged, and subtle recognition of contradictions became apparent. The social trap tightened. Marcus and I continued meticulous documentation. Every reaction, every whispered question, every subtle observation was recorded. Patterns emerged, showing how social perception was evolving, how the seeds of doubt were growing organically. The strategy relied on patience, precision, and restraint, never confrontation, never overt manipulation. Every action, every casual remark, was designed to maximize social pressure while remaining legally and ethically unassailable. Emily's engagement remained central. Her observations mirrored the social dynamics I was orchestrating. During quiet evenings, she would ask questions about fairness, truth, and why some people lie. These moments became opportunities to reinforce lessons about integrity, strategy, and measured action. She was learning firsthand that strength often lies in subtlety and timing, not in aggression. The social trap reached its first crescendo at a neighborhood gathering. A casually mentioned financial discrepancy, reinforced by small hints of prior inconsistencies, caused a ripple of questions. Vanessa's defensive response, a forced laugh and abrupt change of topic, confirmed the success of the setup. Friends whispered, neighbors noticed, and colleagues began observing carefully. The trap had been sprung quietly, invisibly, yet effectively. By the end of the week, the social network Vanessa had relied upon for support had begun to fracture. Friends were hesitant, neighbors questioned, colleagues noted inconsistencies. The carefully constructed perception of control was unraveling. Pride had become her vulnerability, patience had become my weapon, and strategy had begun to dominate the battlefield. Emily's trust in me had deepened further. Her recognition of subtle shifts, her understanding of strategic patience, and her growing belief in my integrity reinforced the purpose behind every move. The lessons of careful observation, measured action, and patient exposure were taking root in her young mind. The war of social perception, carefully orchestrated and methodically executed, had reached a critical point. Vanessa's influence was diminished, her credibility eroded, and the pressure mounting. Social momentum, combined with strategic exposure, investigative oversight, and Emily's growing trust, set the stage for the ultimate reveal. Patience, strategy, and subtlety had transformed perception. The social trap had ensnared Vanessa, and each thread of doubt pulled by friends, neighbors, and colleagues tightened the net. The facade of control, once invulnerable, was now fragile, vulnerable, and cracking under the weight of carefully orchestrated truth. And as I watched Emily fall asleep that night, small hand curled against mine, I knew that the careful, patient strategy was not just winning the battle. It was teaching her invaluable lessons about truth, resilience, and the quiet power of calculated action. The social trap had worked. Pride had been exploited. Lies were beginning to unravel. And the next phase of exposure, carefully prepared and strategically timed, was ready to take the stage. The moment I had been waiting for was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable once it arrived. Vanessa's carefully constructed fortress of lies, charm, and manipulation was beginning to crumble. The walls she had built to protect herself, to manipulate perception, and to dominate social spaces were closing in. And she knew it. I could see it in the slight twitch of her jaw, the forced brightness in her eyes, and the way her laughter now carried an edge of panic. Pride, once her armor, had become her prison. It started with the small things. Glances from friends that lingered a little too long, whispered conversations she couldn't quite overhear but sensed. Subtle inconsistencies she had forgotten to smooth over were being noticed. Her social circle, which had once hung on her every word, now hesitated. Questions were asked, doubts raised, and quiet side conversations flourished. The very gossip network she had once used to isolate me was now turning against her, a mirror reflecting her own deceit I had prepared for her. This phase carefully. The first strike of subtle exposure had weakened her credibility. The social trap had turned her pride into a vulnerability. Now it was time to push ever so gently toward the breaking point. Public moments had to be orchestrated with precision. Embarrassment, if too obvious, could trigger defensiveness, denial, and a tightening of her web. But carefully placed truths, small contradictions revealed at the right time, could unravel her facade without direct confrontation. Emily noticed the changes too. Her small observations became increasingly perceptive, reflecting a clarity I had hoped she would develop. One evening, as we organized her art projects on the dining table, she whispered, "Dad, I think Mom's scared. She keeps looking over her shoulder." I nodded, kneeling to her level. "Yes, Emily. When people build their world on lies, the truth has a way of finding them. It's not about fear, it's about learning that honesty is stronger than deception." Her wide eyes reflected understanding, and I felt a surge of quiet pride. She was beginning to see what I had hoped to teach her. Integrity is quiet, consistent, and unshakable. Public confrontations began subtly. At a local community fundraiser, Vanessa attempted to assert her authority, recounting contributions, praising her role, and emphasizing her competence. But the cracks were visible. A volunteer, previously loyal to her narrative, questioned a minor detail in front of a small group. Vanessa's reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath, a stammered response, an attempt to regain control. But control had already begun slipping through her fingers. Gossip, once a tool she wielded with finesse, now worked independently. Friends who had long doubted quietly exchanged notes and observations. Neighbors began to question financial transactions she had claimed to manage responsibly. Colleagues noticed inconsistencies in emails, receipts, and explanations. The web of influence she had relied upon so heavily was now tangled and fraying. Every public slip, every hint of nervousness was amplified by perception and whispered commentary. Detective Holt's role grew increasingly pivotal. She had been following the trail of financial inconsistencies, social contradictions, and small yet significant behavioral anomalies. Every document, every witness account, and every observed lie was cataloged meticulously. Vanessa's previous attempts to manipulate evidence and perception could not withstand the scrutiny of a trained investigator. Her actions were now under observation from multiple angles, creating pressure she could neither anticipate nor control. Internally, I wrestled with my own moral compass. Revenge was tempting in its purest form, an opportunity to humiliate, to correct, and to expose, but I knew that strategy required restraint. Each action had to balance justice with ethical precision. Public embarrassment had to be orchestrated carefully, evidence had to be irrefutable, and every step had to reinforce integrity rather than cruelty. Revenge without control becomes indistinguishable from vindictiveness. I reminded myself constantly, the goal was justice, restoration, and teaching Emily the value of patience, intelligence, and moral clarity. Vanessa's paranoia became increasingly pronounced. At social events, she scanned rooms with anxious eyes, adjusted her posture excessively, and repeated talking points that now sounded rehearsed. Every slight hesitation or questioning glance from a friend or colleague intensified her internal panic. Pride, which had once fortified her public image, was now a constant source of tension. She was trapped in her own web, and each strategic move we made tightened the snare without her realizing it. I orchestrated small public embarrassments with meticulous care. At a neighborhood book club, Vanessa attempted to recount a philanthropic contribution she had supposedly made. I subtly referenced an unrelated, verifiable fact that contradicted her claim, a fact framed as casual concern for accuracy. Her reaction, a tight smile, rapid eye movements, and a faint stutter, was exactly what I anticipated. Other attendees noticed, exchanging subtle glances, raising quiet questions, and unconsciously comparing notes. The domino effect was in motion. Emily continued to observe and learn. One afternoon, while we walked home from school, she asked, "Dad, why does she keep pretending?" I explained gently, sometimes people lie to protect themselves or to maintain control. But lies are fragile, Emily. They break under the weight of truth, patience, and observation. Her small hand squeezed mine, and I realized that our struggle was not just about exposing deceit. It was also about teaching resilience, discernment, and empathy. Marcus and I coordinated meticulously behind the scenes. Every public moment was pre-planned, every potential slip monitored, and every subtle exposure documented. Timing was critical. Too early, and Vanessa could mount a counter-offensive. Too late, and the momentum could dissipate. The breaking point had to appear organic, a natural consequence of her actions, not an orchestrated attack. The key was balance. Control without force, exposure without aggression. Vanessa's social isolation intensified. Friends who had once repeated her narrative now hesitated. Neighbors questioned her claims, and colleagues scrutinized her statements. Each micro-moment of doubt compounded the next, creating a crescendo of uncertainty she could neither anticipate nor mitigate. The breaking point was not a single moment. It was a culmination of subtle, precise exposures that eroded her credibility and control. Detective Holt's progress was undeniable. Evidence collected over months, combined with social and financial inconsistencies, provided a compelling case. Vanessa's attempts to manipulate perception could not withstand scrutiny. Holt's observations were subtle but penetrating, creating a pressure environment that accelerated her unraveling. Every lie, contradiction, and act of deception became a thread leading toward accountability. I reflected frequently on the ethical dimension of our strategy. Each public embarrassment was calculated, each exposure framed in truth, and each action measured to prevent unnecessary cruelty. The moral high ground was not merely a principle, it was a strategic tool. It ensured that our actions would be respected, that Emily would learn lessons in integrity, and that the eventual outcome would be just rather than vengeful. The psychological tension reached a peak during a community gala. Vanessa attempted to dominate conversations, assert her influence, and project confidence. A casual comment I made, referencing a minor but verifiable financial discrepancy, triggered a visible reaction, a sharp intake of breath, a tense posture, and a rapidly changing facial expression. Guests noticed, whispers spread, and her carefully curated facade began to fracture publicly. The breaking point was unfolding. Emily's role, though passive, was central to the emotional arc of the narrative. Her growing trust, observations of social dynamics, and understanding of ethical strategy reinforced the purpose behind every move. One evening, she whispered as we prepared dinner, "Dad, people are starting to see the truth." I nodded, smiling gently. "Yes, Emily. Truth has a way of coming out, even when people try to hide it. Patience and careful planning make it inevitable." Vanessa's internal turmoil was evident in increasingly erratic behavior. At tea social gatherings, she alternated between overly confident assertions and visible anxiety. Her attempts to manipulate perception were counterproductive. The more she forced control, the more apparent her instability became. Friends exchanged subtle glances, neighbors whispered quietly, and colleagues observed contradictions, creating a compounded effect of social and psychological pressure. The breaking point was reinforced by multiple channels: financial evidence, social exposure, and investigative oversight. Each component functioned synergistically. Vanessa's web of lies, once unassailable, now exposed, created an environment in which public perception, legal scrutiny, and social pressure converged. The tension was palpable, both internally for her and externally among those observing. Emily's development paralleled the unfolding strategy. She began recognizing integrity, moral clarity, and the importance of patience in confronting deception. Small conversations during bedtime stories, homework sessions, and casual walks reinforced lessons in ethics, discernment, and resilience. She was not just a witness to the breaking point. She was absorbing the principles that would guide her own future. Public moments of exposure continued subtly but effectively. At a local school fundraiser, Vanessa attempted to assert control by recounting her management of donations and volunteer efforts. I referenced minor, verifiable inconsistencies, framed as concern for accuracy. Her reaction, a combination of nervous laughter, quick topic changes, and visible tension, signaled the effectiveness of the strategy. Guests exchanged subtle glances, whispered questions, and began observing details previously overlooked. Detective Holt's observations, social perception shifts, and strategic public exposure created a converging pressure environment. Vanessa's confidence eroded visibly, her narrative faltered under scrutiny, and the inevitability of exposure became undeniable. Each carefully orchestrated move brought her closer to a public unraveling, achieving the goal of the breaking point without overt confrontation or unnecessary cruelty. As the days progressed, Vanessa's behavior became increasingly erratic. She overcompensated in public, projecting confidence while internally struggling to maintain composure. Friends and neighbors noted inconsistencies, whispered among themselves, and began questioning previously unquestioned assumptions. The breaking point, meticulously prepared and patiently executed, was now fully in motion. Emily's trust and moral clarity deepened. Her observations, small questions, and recognition of integrity reinforced the purpose of the strategy. She was learning firsthand the power of patience, careful planning, and ethical action in confronting deceit. Each subtle shift in social perception was both a victory in the broader strategy and a teaching moment for her. By the end of the week, Vanessa's public and social credibility had eroded significantly. Friends hesitated, neighbors questioned, and colleagues scrutinized Detective Holt had gathered enough evidence to pursue legal action if necessary. The walls Vanessa had built around herself had collapsed under the combined weight of social, financial, and investigative scrutiny. The breaking point was achieved. And as I watched Emily asleep that night, small hand resting against mine, I felt a quiet sense of resolution. Justice had been achieved not through fury, but through patience, strategy, and ethical precision. The breaking point was not merely a public unraveling. It was a lesson in resilience, moral clarity, and the quiet power of truth. Vanessa had fallen, not through chaos, but through the careful orchestration of inevitability. The morning of the hearing arrived like the quiet before a storm. I stood outside the courthouse, the crisp autumn air cutting through the tension like a knife. My uniform was long gone, replaced by a tailored suit, neat tie, and polished shoes, a symbol of the life I had reclaimed. Emily held my hand, small and trusting, her eyes wide with curiosity and hope. She didn't yet fully understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold, but she knew enough to sense that truth, finally, would rise. Vanessa arrived shortly after, impeccably dressed, hair perfectly styled, makeup flawless. She carried herself with the air of someone who believed in control, who thought her charm and lies would carry her through yet another crisis. But I could see it. The small twitch in her left hand. The subtle tremor when she greeted the lawyer beside her. The forced ease in her smile. Pride had once been her armor, but today it could not shield her. The courtroom was packed with curious neighbors, friends who had once repeated her narrative without question, and colleagues who had hesitated to take sides. Whispers filled the room, low hums of anticipation. Everyone wanted to see the outcome of the months-long battle, though few understood its depth. I could feel the collective tension pressing against my chest, but my focus was singular: Emily, truth, and justice. Detective Holt sat nearby, a quiet anchor amid the chaos. She had worked meticulously behind the scenes, gathering every shred of evidence, verifying every document, and tracking the web of Vanessa's deceit. Her presence was reassuring. She had been a guiding hand, a subtle force ensuring that facts, not theatrics, would dictate the outcome. Today, facts would speak louder than lies. The first hour of the hearing involved formalities, procedural exchanges, and attempts by Vanessa's attorney to project confidence. She maintained her practiced smile, nodding politely, feigning concern. But the foundation of her narrative had been shaken. Every whisper, every doubt planted in the social sphere, every documented inconsistency was now waiting to collide in court. When my lawyer called me to present evidence, I felt a calm I hadn't experienced since my first day home from deployment. Years of training, patience, and strategic observation coalesced into this moment. The financial statements, emails, forged documents, and witness testimonies, all carefully cataloged, cross-referenced, and validated, were now ready to confront the lies head-on. Each piece of evidence was a thread in the tapestry of truth, woven to dismantle Vanessa's facade. I presented the first set of documents. Bank statements showing transfers from joint accounts to Vanessa's personal accounts, masked as payments for services that never existed. Vanessa's expression tightened, her practiced composure faltering for the first time in public. Whispers rose among the attendees as the reality of the evidence sank in. The first cracks were visible. Next came the emails and correspondence I had meticulously saved over the months. Each one highlighted her deliberate manipulation, emails to friends framing me as unstable, letters to colleagues portraying false narratives, and carefully crafted messages that disguised her own theft. One by one, her lies were exposed. Each revelation brought subtle gasps, exchanged glances, and a growing understanding among those present. Vanessa's carefully curated image was a lie. Emily watched, perched on the edge of her seat, her small hand gripping mine tightly. She was silent but attentive, absorbing the gravity of truth in action. I could see the spark in her eyes, a mix of relief, pride, and awe. She was witnessing justice, not as an abstract concept, But as a living, unfolding reality, Vanessa's social allies shifted uncomfortably. Friends who had once defended her silently questioned their loyalty. Neighbors avoided eye contact, and colleagues shifted in their seats. The web of deceit that had protected her for months was unraveling in real time. Pride and social influence, her greatest tools, had become liabilities. Each revelation undermined her narrative, leaving her increasingly isolated. Detective Holt presented her findings next, corroborating my documentation with professional precision. The pattern was undeniable. Vanessa had orchestrated a complex web of lies and manipulation, targeting me, my finances, and my reputation. Her attempts to control perception, once so effective, were now irrelevant under the weight of irrefutable evidence. Every contradiction, every misstatement, and every deliberate omission was laid bare. Throughout the proceedings, I maintained composure. Anger, betrayal, and years of pent-up frustration bubbled beneath the surface, but I channeled them into clarity and dignity. Exposing her truth without rage, without theatrics, ensured that the focus remained on facts and consequences, not on personal vengeance. It was the ultimate demonstration that justice, not fury, holds the greatest power. When witnesses, friends and colleagues who had been subtly influenced by Vanessa's lies, testified, the effect was profound. Each account reinforced the documented evidence, confirming patterns of manipulation, deception, and misrepresentation. Even those who had initially supported her were forced to acknowledge the truth. Vanessa's expression faltered with each testimony. The facade crumbled further, layer by layer. In a pivotal moment, the court clerk read a series of financial discrepancies and false statements directly linked to Vanessa. Her face drained of color. She attempted to respond, to interject, but words failed her. The room was silent, the weight of truth pressing upon her like a physical force. Pride, which had once been her shield, now became a glaring reminder of her vulnerability. Emily whispered, "Dad, it's happening." Her voice was soft but confident, carrying the clarity and moral understanding that had been growing within her. I nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "Yes, sweetie. The truth always finds a way." Outside the courtroom, social perception shifted irrevocably. Friends who had once repeated her lies quietly distanced themselves, exchanging subtle looks of acknowledgement. Neighbors began discussing her actions in hushed tones, the gossip that once strengthened her narrative now amplifying her downfall. Vanessa's carefully curated social image had disintegrated completely, leaving her exposed, isolated, and undeniably accountable. The final confrontation occurred when I was given the chance to speak. I remained calm, composed, and measured, emphasizing facts over emotion. I presented the cumulative evidence, highlighting patterns, corroborated testimonies, and documented proof. Vanessa listened, pale and silent, as every lie, every manipulation, and every betrayal was unveiled. The courtroom was wrapped, the collective realization of truth palpable. Vanessa attempted a final argument, a last-ditch effort to reclaim credibility. But her words fell flat. Social allies were gone, witnesses had confirmed the narrative, and the evidence was overwhelming. Pride had blinded her to the inevitability of exposure, and now, faced with undeniable truth, she had no defense. As the judge reviewed the documentation and testimonies, the magnitude of Vanessa's deceit became clear. Legal consequences were imminent: financial restitution, potential charges for fraud, and social accountability. Justice, long delayed, was finally being served. Emily's reaction was heartwarming. Tears glistened in her eyes as she whispered, "Dad, you did it." I knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We did it together, Emily." Patience, planning, and truth always win. Her small smile reflected the emotional catharsis of seeing lies defeated, of witnessing justice unfold firsthand. Vanessa's downfall was complete not through anger or spectacle, but through careful, deliberate exposure. Her social allies abandoned her, her credibility evaporated, and her manipulative narratives were laid bare. The culmination of months of strategic planning, ethical patience, and unwavering focus on truth had reached its apex. In the days following the hearing, the social fallout continued. Former friends distanced themselves, neighbors discussed the revelations openly, and colleagues implemented measures to prevent future manipulation. Vanessa's influence, which had once seemed unassailable, was now a cautionary tale of hubris, deceit, and the power of patient, strategic justice. Emily's growth mirrored the unfolding justice. She understood the importance of integrity, observation, and the quiet power of truth. Lessons learned from her father's strategic patience and ethical approach became embedded in her worldview, shaping her moral compass and reinforcing the values I had strived to impart. As we left the courthouse, Emily running ahead to greet familiar faces, I felt a profound sense of closure. Justice had been served, not through revenge, but through diligence, integrity, and patience. The reveal had been complete, legal, social, and personal vindication achieved. The triumph was not only mine. It belonged to Emily, to those who had witnessed truth prevail, and to the principle that lies, no matter how carefully constructed, cannot withstand persistent, patient, and principled exposure. The battle had been long, the strategy complex, and the consequences inevitable. As we walked home, Emily skipping ahead, turning occasionally to glance back with a small smile, I realized that the ultimate victory was not humiliation, it was restoration. Social perception, moral clarity, and justice had converged to correct a wrong, proving that patience, careful planning, and truth are stronger than pride, deceit, and manipulation. Vanessa's world had collapsed, her lies laid bare for all to see. My dignity remained intact, Emily's trust was strengthened, and the long shadow of betrayal had finally lifted. The reveal was not an act of vengeance. It was a manifestation of strategic justice, a testament to the power of persistence, ethical action, and unwavering commitment to truth. The days after Vanessa's public unraveling were quiet, almost surreal. The courthouse drama, the whispered gossip, and the months of meticulous strategy had finally settled into reality. For the first time in what felt like years, I could breathe without a weight pressing on my chest. Emily and I walked through our neighborhood, the autumn sun casting long shadows, a calm wind rustling the leaves. The chaos had passed, but its echoes lingered in small ways. Empty seats at social events, hushed conversations drifting through the air, and the faint awareness that life had changed irrevocably. Rebuilding began in the most intimate of spaces. Home or apartment, once a battleground of absence, suspicion, and stolen trust, became a sanctuary every morning. I watched Emily move through her routines with a sense of quiet purpose, and for the first time, I truly felt like a father present in her life. Breakfast became ritual, not just for sustenance but for connection. We discussed homework, stories, and small daily victories. Emily's laughter, once hesitant around me due to fear and confusion, now rang freely through our rooms, a sound I had longed to hear during the months she was caught between loyalties. Vanessa's absence from our lives created a strange vacuum. Her social network, fractured and ashamed, largely ignored her former allies whispered behind closed doors, never daring to publicly align with someone who had been so thoroughly exposed. Friends who had been swayed by her manipulation quietly distanced themselves, recalibrating their perception of both her and me. The irony was not lost. The very social perception she had weaponized against me now served as a shield for my integrity. Trust, when built on truth, proved stronger than deception. I spent hours reflecting on what had transpired, cataloging lessons learned, and teaching Emily how to navigate a world where appearances can be deceiving. Small conversations became opportunities to reinforce critical thinking, moral clarity, and strategic awareness. Always protect your family, Emily, I said one evening, tucking her into bed. Trust carefully. Observe the actions behind the words, and document what matters. Truth is your strongest ally. She nodded solemnly, absorbing the weight of these lessons with an understanding beyond her years. Social life gradually resumed a semblance of normalcy. Parents at Emily's school now greeted me with nods of respect rather than suspicion. Colleagues and acquaintances approached with subtle acknowledgement of the ordeal, though conversations were tempered by civility. It was a quiet restoration of status, not through vanity, but through demonstrated integrity and resilience. The social gossip, once weaponized against me, had flipped into validation, proof that patience, evidence, and ethical action can restore credibility even after intense betrayal. Work, too, became a focus. I returned to consulting contracts with renewed energy, balancing professional obligations with parenting responsibilities. The discipline instilled in me by years of military service now applied to everyday life, structured routines, calculated priorities, and an unyielding commitment to integrity. Each professional success, small or large, reinforced the lessons of resilience and strategic patience that had carried me through the months of betrayal. Emily's growth mirrored my own. She had begun taking initiative in school, demonstrating empathy toward friends, and handling small social conflicts with maturity. Observing her, I realized that the battle against Vanessa had imparted more than justice. It had shaped Emily's character, instilling a sense of discernment, moral clarity, and the courage to face manipulation when it arose. She was learning at a young age that strength is quiet, patient, and principled, not loud or vengeful. Vanessa's presence or absence continued to ripple outward. Former friends and neighbors, now wary of public perception, largely avoided her. Attempts to regain social status were met with subtle derision or outright exclusion. Her financial maneuverings had been exposed, legal consequences loomed, and her influence evaporated. What remained was a cautionary tale. Hubris, manipulation, and deceit, no matter how well hidden, eventually meet consequences when patience, documentation, and truth are applied strategically. I also began reconciling emotionally with secondary characters. Friends who had hesitated during the height of Vanessa's manipulations reached out, offering small gestures of apology or acknowledgement. Some were tentative, unsure if reconciliation was possible. Others quietly demonstrated support through actions rather than words, checking in on Emily, offering professional advice, or assisting with daily routines. These gestures were subtle reminders that relationships are complex, often requiring time, patience, and observation to restore. The subtle advice that had carried me through the ordeal became part of our daily life. I documented interactions carefully, not out of suspicion, but as a precaution and lesson for Emily. Transparency, accountability, and observation became cornerstones of our life. Documentation isn't just evidence, I explained one evening while organizing our household records. It's protection, clarity, and a way to ensure the truth always has a voice. Emily listened intently, the wisdom of her young mind grasping concepts beyond her years. Vanessa's absence also offered space for reflection. I realized that the emotional toll of betrayal could be managed through structure, strategic thought, and the reinforcement of ethical principles. Life after confrontation was not simply victory. It was reconstruction, healing, and recalibration. The chaos had ended, but its lessons remained, guiding daily decisions, parenting approaches, and social interactions. Community engagement became a pathway to healing. Volunteering at Emily's school, assisting local charities, and participating in neighborhood initiatives offered avenues to rebuild social ties positively. Each action reinforced credibility and restored trust not through rhetoric, but through demonstrable, consistent behavior. The contrast between Vanessa's manipulation and my careful integrity became evident to the broader community, reinforcing the lessons of patience and strategic truth. Emily's observations were profound. One afternoon, she remarked while helping distribute food at a local shelter, "Dad, when people see good, they notice, even if it takes a while." Her insight, simple yet piercing, reflected the core of what I had hoped to teach her, that consistent integrity and patience outweigh deceit and manipulation, even when the consequences are delayed. The subtle tension of Vanessa's potential resurgence faded with time. Legal consequences loomed for her, social isolation deepened, and the lessons imparted to Emily were already embedded in her worldview. It became increasingly clear that the life we were rebuilding was resilient not only because of justice served, but because of the careful, patient, and principled approach that had guided every step. I reflected often on the emotional journey. Betrayal had been deeply painful, but it also forced clarity, strategic thinking, and ethical patience. I shared these reflections with Emily in age-appropriate ways, emphasizing moral strength, resilience, and the power of evidence over emotion. Each conversation, each lesson, reinforced the principle that life after deception can be not only possible, but enriched by experience. Financial stability returned gradually. The restitution process, combined with careful management of professional contracts, allowed Emily and me to regain security and independence. The months of planning and strategic action, once an abstract exercise in patience and justice, now manifested in tangible stability, freedom, and restored dignity. Subtle reconciliation with secondary characters, those who had hesitated, been misled, or misjudged, offered opportunities to rebuild trust without compromising integrity. These relationships, managed carefully, became part of the broader lesson of discernment. Trust must be earned, observed, and reinforced through consistent behavior. Emily absorbed these lessons, recognizing that human relationships are layered and require both patience and wisdom. Social gossip, once a weapon against me, continued to evolve. Vanessa's downfall became a cautionary tale discussed quietly in neighborhoods, schools, and workplaces. Friends who had supported her were forced to reassess alliances, while those who had observed truth now recognized integrity as a guiding principle. Public perception, when aligned with facts, reinforced the moral victory, further cementing the lessons of patience, observation, and principled action. Life at home became the anchor. Simple routines, dinner preparation, homework help, evening walks, grounded Emily and me. We spoke often about past events, framing lessons in moral clarity, ethical resilience, and strategic observation. Each discussion reinforced her understanding of integrity, patience, and the importance of protecting oneself and loved ones without resorting to malice. Vanessa's continued absence, her fractured social network, and looming legal challenges became a backdrop rather than a constant pressure. The focus shifted to restoration, growth, and the emotional well-being of Emily and me. Small victories, social acceptance, professional stability, and personal peace accumulated to form a larger sense of accomplishment. Advice learned from the ordeal was integrated subtly into daily life. I reminded Emily, observe carefully, trust selectively, and protect those you love. Evidence matters. Integrity matters more. These lessons, embedded in routine, conversations, and modeled behavior, became part of the moral fabric of our lives. Community engagement, personal reflection, and deliberate social rebuilding created a sense of stability that had been absent for so long. Each positive action, no matter how small, reinforced resilience, credibility, and the enduring power of principled patience. Emily flourished, socially and emotionally, witnessing firsthand the tangible benefits of strategic, ethical action. I occasionally reflected on Vanessa, not with anger, but with acknowledgement of the lessons learned. Hubris, deception, and pride had consequences, but my focus remained on the present and future. Healing required attention to what could be built, restored, and nurtured, rather than dwelling on past betrayal. This perspective allowed Emily and me to flourish without the burden of ongoing resentment. Subtle reconciliation with certain secondary characters progressed slowly, guided by observation, patience, and moral clarity. Those who had hesitated during the conflict gradually demonstrated integrity, actions aligning with accountability and ethical behavior. Emily observed these interactions, reinforcing her understanding that trust is conditional, earned, and observable through consistent action. Daily life stabilized into routines that balanced professional obligations, parenting, and personal growth. Weekends involved small adventures, school projects, and community involvement, all reinforcing the lessons of patience, observation, and ethical engagement. Emily thrived, her confidence growing alongside the rebuilding of our social and personal lives. As weeks turned into months, the narrative of betrayal and justice became part of our shared story, rather than an ongoing battle. Emily's understanding of morality, resilience, and strategic patience deepened, providing a foundation for navigating future challenges. Vanessa's absence, legal consequences, and social isolation served as constant reminders of the power of integrity, observation, and principled action. Financial stability, restored reputation, and regained respect in social circles allowed for incremental rebuilding of personal and community ties. The contrast between Vanessa's downfall and our recovery illustrated the long-term impact of strategic patience, ethical action, and careful documentation. Lessons learned were now embedded in the fabric of everyday life. Emily's maturity, social perception, and moral clarity became evident in interactions at school, with friends, and within the community. Observing her growth reinforced the value of patience, strategic planning, and ethical conduct. She was learning that integrity is quiet but powerful, subtle but transformative. Reflecting on the journey, I realized that the aftermath of betrayal is never simple, but it can be freeing. Life rebuilt on truth, patience, and moral clarity creates resilience, confidence, and a foundation for lasting stability. The social, emotional, and professional victories were not fleeting. They were enduring, built on deliberate, principled actions over time. As Emily and I settled into an evening routine, quiet and calm, I felt a profound sense of resolution. The past had been navigated, justice had been served, and the present offered opportunities for growth, healing, and stability. Lessons learned were now guiding our lives, shaping Emily's worldview, and reinforcing the power of strategic, principled action. The aftermath, though complex, was liberating. Social respect had returned, family bonds were strengthened, and the principles of patience, integrity, and observation had been reinforced through lived experience. Emily's trust, understanding, and moral growth were the true victories, the culmination of months of careful planning, ethical patience, and unwavering focus on truth. Life had been rebuilt, but its lessons endured. Every interaction, every decision, and every relationship was now viewed through the lens of careful observation, ethical action, and strategic patience. Emily's presence, growth, and understanding were living proof that even the deepest betrayals could yield opportunities for teaching, growth, and long-term resilience. And as I watched her drift to sleep, small hand tucked under the blanket, I knew that the lessons of the past would guide us forward. Healing, rebuilding, and ethical strength were no longer abstract. They were the reality we lived daily. Life after betrayal was not only possible, it was richer, stronger, and infused with the enduring power of truth. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of our apartment, casting golden light across the living room. For the first time in years, I could sit in quiet reflection without the weight of betrayal pressing on my chest. The months of strategizing, enduring manipulation, and patiently waiting for justice had culminated in a life I had longed to reclaim, not just for myself, but for Emily. Watching her sit cross-legged on the rug, sketching in her notebook, I realized that the true victory wasn't just about exposing Vanessa or reclaiming our reputation. It was about the life we had rebuilt, the lessons she had absorbed, and the resilience we had both cultivated. I remember the early days after deployment, when the shock of betrayal felt like a physical blow. Vanessa's deceit had stripped me of trust, dignity, and security, leaving me staring into a void of uncertainty. At first, it was hard to imagine that any sense of normalcy, let alone peace, could exist again. But through patience, meticulous planning, and unwavering commitment to truth, the impossible became possible. The journey had been arduous, but the outcome was worth every moment of struggle. Emily looked up from her sketches and smiled. "Dad, do you think people always get what they deserve?" Her question, innocent yet profound, reminded me of how much she had grown emotionally and morally over the months. I paused, considering the right words. "Not always immediately, Emily. But patience, observation, and doing the right thing give truth a way to prevail. People who build their lives on lies may seem strong for a time, but in the long run, honesty and integrity have more power than deceit." She nodded thoughtfully, returning to her artwork. I watched her for a while, marveling at how resilient, empathetic, and perceptive she had become. She had seen betrayal, witnessed justice, and absorbed lessons in moral clarity that would guide her for the rest of her life. The emotional closure she experienced wasn't just about Vanessa. It was about understanding resilience, patience, and the importance of family above all else. Vanessa's fate, meanwhile, was fully sealed. Legal consequences were now inevitable. Her financial manipulations had been exposed, and restitution payments were in process. Court judgments had gone against her, supported by the evidence I and Detective Holt had meticulously compiled. Socially, she was isolated. Friends who had once elevated her to positions of trust now quietly distanced themselves, avoiding her gaze and withholding invitations. Even her professional network, built partially on charm and misrepresentation, had severed ties. She had become a cautionary tale of hubris, deceit, and the dangers of manipulating perception for personal gain. Despite her downfall, I found no joy in malice. The satisfaction lay not in humiliation, but in the restoration of integrity. Watching Vanessa face the consequences of her actions served as a reminder that justice, while delayed, is powerful and enduring. My focus was on the life I had rebuilt, the lessons imparted to Emily, and the moral clarity we now shared. True strength, I realized, is measured not by revenge, but by resilience, ethical consistency, and the ability to protect those you love. As evening descended, Emily curled up on the sofa beside me, resting her head on my shoulder. "Dad," she murmured, "I'm glad we're together now. I feel safe." My throat tightened with emotion. Months of hardship, uncertainty, and strategic patience had led to this moment, a simple, profound sense of security, connection, and trust. "We are together, Emily," I whispered, brushing her hair back gently. "And nothing will take that away. Family comes first. Always." Reflection became a daily practice. Each evening, I considered the lessons of the past, the growth of Emily, and the journey we had undertaken. Resilience had been forged in adversity, patience tested in the face of betrayal, and moral clarity strengthened through strategic action. Each challenge had provided insight, the importance of documenting interactions, maintaining vigilance, and approaching conflict with careful, ethical planning. These were lessons not just for survival, but for thriving in a world where deception and manipulation sometimes lurk unnoticed. Community life had slowly returned to balance. Neighbors and friends who had observed the ordeal respected the integrity of our actions. Professional relationships stabilized, founded now on competence, trust, and demonstrated moral consistency rather than charm or appearances. Even casual acquaintances recognized the resilience and strength required to navigate such a complex social and legal conflict. The restoration of credibility was subtle, but profound, validating the long months of patience and meticulous planning. Emily's own resilience flourished. She engaged confidently with peers, navigating social dynamics with discernment and empathy. She observed cause and effect in human behavior, understanding the consequences of deception and the enduring value of truth. Her education extended beyond academics into the realms of social intelligence, moral reasoning, and strategic patience. Every small decision she made reflected lessons absorbed from witnessing the downfall of dishonesty and the triumph of integrity. Family dynamics became central to our emotional recovery. Small routines, shared meals, storytelling, and evening reflections reinforced bonds that betrayal had threatened to sever. I emphasized the importance of trust, love, and communication. "Emily," I said one night while we prepared dinner together, "life will present challenges. People may disappoint you. But if you hold fast to truth, protect your family, and act with integrity, you can navigate even the darkest situations." She listened intently, absorbing every word with the clarity and wisdom that had grown in her over the months. Social consequences for Vanessa continued to unfold. Invitations ceased, colleagues withdrew support, and her credibility was irreparably damaged. The contrast between her isolation and the restoration of our lives was stark. Where she had relied on deception and social manipulation, we had relied on truth, strategy, and ethical action. The lesson was clear: influence built on falsehoods is fragile, while integrity sustains strength, respect, and resilience. Financially, we were secure. Restitution, careful management of contracts, and strategic rebuilding of assets ensured that Emily and I could live without fear of disruption. The months of planning, documentation, and strategic patience have provided not only justice, but stability, enabling us to focus on personal growth, education, and the emotional well-being of our small family unit. Reflection on the journey brought a subtle sense of pride, not in revenge or vindication, but in the ability to navigate adversity with patience, moral clarity, and focus on what truly mattered. Each step had been deliberate, exposing lies, safeguarding Emily, and restoring our lives without succumbing to fury. The ultimate victory lay in integrity, resilience, and the enduring bond between father and daughter. Emily's insight, expressed in quiet moments, reinforced the lessons I had hoped to impart. One afternoon, while planting flowers in the balcony garden, she remarked, "Truth feels stronger than lies, even when lies are loud." Her observation, simple yet profound, encapsulated the moral arc of our experience. Integrity, patience, and strategic action proved stronger than manipulation and deception. Advice for others crystallized through reflection. Document interactions, protect loved ones, maintain moral clarity, and exercise patience. Avoid impulsive action fueled by anger. Instead, strategize with ethical precision. Resilience is built over time, and justice often arrives not through fury, but through calm, deliberate, and principled action. These lessons, learned the hard way, became guiding principles for Emily and me as we moved forward. Vanessa's ultimate accountability reinforced these lessons. Legal judgments, social isolation, and professional consequences served as enduring reminders of the cost of deceit. She remained a cautionary figure, a demonstration of how hubris, manipulation, and dishonesty inevitably meet consequence when faced with patient, principled resistance. Observing the ripple effects of her downfall provided further insight into the power of ethical strategy, evidence-based action, and unwavering commitment to truth. Our home became a haven. Evenings were filled with quiet reflection, shared stories, and planning for the future. Emily thrived in this environment, absorbing lessons in resilience, strategy, and empathy. Each day reinforced the importance of family, moral clarity, and the enduring value of patience in overcoming adversity. The emotional recovery was ongoing, yet steady, providing a foundation for growth, learning, and happiness. Subtle social reconciliation occurred in limited instances. Certain neighbors and colleagues who had hesitated during the conflict demonstrated integrity by supporting our family discreetly. These interactions, guided by observation and trust, reinforced the lessons that relationships are layered and require discernment. Emily observed these nuances, understanding the balance between trust, caution, and forgiveness in human interactions. As months passed, Life settled into a rhythm of normalcy, stability, and quiet joy. Emily's education, social engagement, and emotional growth flourished alongside restored professional and community ties. The contrast between the chaos of betrayal and the calm of restoration highlighted the efficacy of strategic, ethical, and patient action. Our lives, once disrupted by deception, were now guided by truth, integrity, and love. I often reflected on the broader lessons of the journey. Betrayal, while painful, had catalyzed clarity, resilience, and the cultivation of moral strength. Strategic patience, careful documentation, and principled action had allowed justice to prevail without descending into vindictiveness. Protecting family, prioritizing integrity, and navigating adversity with thoughtful action were the ultimate outcomes. Emily's presence remained central to the emotional resolution. Her trust, understanding, and moral growth were living testaments to the efficacy of patient, principled action. Witnessing justice unfold had strengthened her moral framework, teaching her that integrity, observation, and ethical resilience are more powerful than deceit, manipulation, or pride. Vanessa's legacy, in contrast, became a warning. Manipulation and deceit may provide temporary advantage, but the convergence of patient observation, strategic action, and ethical persistence inevitably results in accountability. Her downfall was a full-circle demonstration of the principles Emily and I now embodied: truth, patience, and moral clarity endure. As the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, I held Emily close. "We've come far, Emily," I whispered. "And the journey isn't over. Life will continue to test us, but with truth, patience, and family, we can face whatever comes next." She nodded, her small hand in mine, eyes reflecting hope, clarity, and resilience. In that quiet moment, the past and its turmoil faded into perspective. Betrayal, justice, and restoration had intertwined to create a legacy not defined by vengeance, but by integrity. Our family had survived, healed, and grown stronger. The lessons learned would guide us indefinitely. Truth is a foundation, patience is a strategy, and love is the ultimate shield against life's challenges. And as the stars began to emerge, twinkling softly in the night sky, I felt a subtle hope for the future. Life was not perfect, but it was ours. The legacy of truth, patience, and family strength had been secured, not just in the world around us, but within Emily, within me, and in the values we would carry forward together. The chapter of betrayal had ended. The story of restoration, love, and ethical resilience had begun. Full-circle justice was achieved, lessons were embedded, and the future, though uncertain, gleamed with the promise of integrity, strength, and hope. Months had passed since Vanessa's downfall. The courtroom drama, the whispered gossip, and the painstaking exposure of lies had faded into memory, but its lessons lingered, quiet, unyielding, and deeply ingrained. Emily and I had rebuilt our life slowly, deliberately, with care and attention to the things that truly mattered: love, trust, and integrity. On a crisp Sunday morning, we walked through the park near our home. Emily's laughter echoed across the benches, chasing away shadows of the past. She ran ahead, skipping and turning back with her radiant smile, reminding me how resilient children are when guided by truth. I followed, a weight lifted from my shoulders, feeling a rare sense of peace that had eluded me for so long. Some of our old friends had returned, cautiously at first, observing our restored life. Some colleagues had quietly apologized for believing Vanessa's stories. And while Vanessa remained a cautionary tale in the background, her presence no longer dictated our lives. We had claimed our story, our narrative, and most importantly, our dignity. Sitting on a bench, Emily leaned against me and whispered, "Dad, do you think she'll ever understand what she lost?" I smiled softly, brushing her hair back. "Perhaps, Emily. But understanding isn't the point. Living with integrity, protecting those you love, and staying true to yourself, that's what matters. That's the legacy we carry." As the sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the playground, I realized that justice had not only been served, it had been lived. We were free from deception, stronger from adversity, and ready for the future. Our lives were no longer defined by betrayal, but by resilience, love, and the quiet power of truth. And in that moment, I knew, whatever storms lay ahead, Emily and I would face them together, guided by the lessons of the past and the unwavering bond of family. The legacy of truth was ours, and it would endure.